Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first virtual artist lecture of the season. My name is Angel Kleiman, and I'm the director of the Rosemary, Duffy, Larson Gallery here on Central Campus of Broward College. Our current exhibition is When the Bough Breaks, organized by our guest tonight, Susanne Slavick. And this exhibition is really unique compared to a lot of other things that we've had so far, because these visual works are also accompanied by poetry and the written word. So we're getting this really unique chance to see visual works and written works together. All of them do embrace the concept of the tree. I hope you've had a chance to check it out in the gallery or at browardvpa.com, and the show will continue through September 22nd in the gallery. So tonight, Susanne will share her insights behind this exhibition, and please save your questions for the end of her talk, but I'm sure she'll be happy to answer them. So without further ado, let's please welcome our speaker tonight, Susanne Slavick.
Hi, everybody. Just sharing my screen here. Can everyone see? Is it working? Okay, good. Thank you. Well, thank you, Angel, and to the whole gallery for hosting the exhibit and for inviting me to speak. And I'm just going to start by saying, you know, I'm primarily a painter, an artist, but I actually began curating about 10 years ago. And one of the reasons I curate is to, you know, activate a kind of deeper understanding of issues that concern me, and hopefully use the shows and all the related programming around them to kind of generate dialogue and hopefully action. And also, curating for me is a way to expand the context for my own work in the studio, which often addresses the causes and the consequences of violence. And so one of my first curatorial projects, it was actually a book and an exhibit, was Out of Rubble, which showed international artists who addressed the aftermath of war. And then I turned to violence on the domestic front and its main instrument, which is the gun. And that show was called Unloaded, and it traveled across the country, sort of addressing the impact of guns on our society. And then you could say that this most recent curatorial project that's in your galleries now is dealing with another kind of violence, really, what we do to and what happens in the environment, specifically involving trees. And you might recognize the title, When the Bough Breaks, from the lullaby, right? The Rockabye Baby, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting it, Rockabye Baby. Anyway, when the bough breaks, the cradle will fall and down will come baby, cradle and all. So it's not a happy ending. It's kind of strange for a lullaby, portends a lot of doom. And so I was struck by this passage from a poem by Bertolt Brecht from 1940, and he asked this question in the poem: what kind of times are they when to talk about trees is almost a crime because it implies silence about so many horrors? And actually, a more recent poet, Adrienne Rich, she's no longer alive, but in 1905, she answered in a part of her poem, "So why do I tell you anything? Because you still listen. Because in times like these, to have you listen at all, it's necessary to talk about trees." And so When the Bough Breaks responds to this poetic dialogue between both artworks and poems that address our abuse of, our alienation from nature. And, you know, the poetry of Brecht and Rich both, it arises from these very deep political motivations and allegiances. And so in choosing the works for this show, I wanted to stress that nature is not apolitical. It's not some neutral place or condition. In fact, it's something caught in and inscribed with the economic and cultural politics of human beings. And W.J.T. Mitchell writes about this in his book called Landscape and Power. It's really wonderful essays. But, you know, despite our history of decimating vast tracts of forests, often in the name of civilization, you know, trees remain indifferent to our existence. They're going to continue offering shade and sustenance and shelter and perhaps survival. They were here long before us, and they'll probably outlive us, whether we neglect or revere them. So I'm going to kind of go through some of the political issues that these works kind of prompted for me, and some of them address colonization and race, as with this work by LeVar Monroe. And his paintings are often populated by these invented people called the Red Bones. This work is no longer in the show because it sold at Miami Basel after the first iteration of this show. But anyway, his fictional narratives are based on documents and artifacts from places in Senegal. And the Red Bones are these boys, really, that are chosen and sent by the wealthy to the front lines to fight for justice and freedom for all. And their sacrifice and ritual is kind of aligned with Joseph Campbell's notion of the hero's journey, right? You've got this adventure, there's some kind of decisive crisis, victory, and then the hero comes home either transformed or enriched. So Monroe, the artist, was born and raised in the Bahamas, which is a self-proclaimed Christian nation that's largely populated by descendants of the 18th century slave trade with West Africa. And this history kind of shapes his examination of this complicated relationship between martyrdom and heroism. And, you know, what are the criteria for salvation? And he's curious about the social and religious rights, such as baptism and being born again. So here you have one of his spy boys who hides in a tree, fleeing from these arrows, kind of like our martyred Saint Sebastian. And we don't know if he survives or perishes. And his hiding in this tree and being under assault kind of reminded me of, you know, our own cruel legacy of trees in American history, with all the lynchings that were conducted over 75 years of our history. We had almost 5,000 lynchings, and trees offered absolutely no sanctuary. I cannot really bear to show the whole cover here. That's why I blacked it out. But this is a book by James Allen, Without Sanctuary, Lynching Photography in America. And it presents 145 souvenir postcards, can you believe it, that document only a fraction of the terrorism that was inflicted on thousands publicly murdered between 1877 and as late as 1950. So trees became these kind of coerced accomplices in these criminal acts that were left unpunished, largely unpunished. And I don't know if you all know the famous song by Billie Holiday called Strange Fruit. It was actually written by Abe Meeropol, but in the song, bodies become, quote, strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. And I think of that as being kind of true of the foundation of this country. So Zoe Charlton, another artist in the show, also deals with race in relation to the environment and culture. Her title for this work on paper is Les Demoiselles, which in French means young women. Les Demoiselles, the Great Outdoors. And it's a deliberate takeoff on a title by Picasso, also called Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. D'Avignon was the name of the street in Paris where there were all the brothels. And this painting by Picasso was included in the super controversial show at Museum of Modern Art in New York. It was called Primitivism in 20th Century Art. And you can see the catalog cover here and Picasso's painting there in the background. And this is a better image of the painting, which is, it was controversial, the show, not this painting per se, but the whole show, because what it did is it took these artifacts from Africa, and juxtaposed them kind of arbitrarily with masters of modernism, as if those objects existed only to influence Western artists and to affirm the superiority of Western culture. And so it was the way the whole thing was framed that was very disturbing to people. So here we have Picasso's painting, which is a portrait of prostitutes, and you can see how he's quoting from these African and Iberian masks. So Charlton's figures are also masked, but her women, at least the two on the right, are standing there quite powerful. Another one almost seems to be kind of cowering in the bushes, holding up this kind of pine tree air freshener. And we don't know, is it like some kind of offering or a talisman against bad luck or something? But either way, it's kind of a lame and puny substitute for all the decimated woodlands that were also appropriated by colonial and corporate classes to kind of feed this bottomless appetite for profit and progress. Because in the inception or the birth of this country, or not even of this country, the first settlers, subduing and conquering the savage land was once considered virtuous. Like to cut down forests was a virtue. These forests were like chaotic. They were untamed, they were wild, they were scary, they weren't considered useful. And it was just like the subduing and enslaving of peoples that were once perceived of as, quote, savage. But the trees in this work are really anything but old growth. They're domesticated with these, technically with these layers of artifice, because what she does is she buys these craft store stickers at like Michael's of trees. And then she copies them and enlarges them and then cuts them out and collages them and hand paints things and assembles them on these large sheets of paper. And so, you know, her Great Outdoors in the title is kind of a tongue-in-cheek Great Outdoors, and it sort of mirrors our contemporary lifestyles, which are really epidemically dislocated from nature. A lot of urban dwellers and even some suburban dwellers really venture out into what we might consider wilderness, right, or nature. So the fake pine tree scent that is being, you know, offered is kind of just like a flimsy masquerade for all of these profound misdeeds in connection to both people and the land and to what we've lost. So the next works are by Clayton Merrill, and you can see by the title, he's referring to global warming and the greenhouse effect. But he's also, if you look at these trees, they allude to this art historical tradition called the picturesque. And the picturesque wanted to think of aesthetic experience as a non-rational one. It was all about these constructed landscapes that were meant to induce terror and awe. Sometimes it was a sublime and beautiful awe, and sometimes it was a kind of terror awe that made us feel like these little specks on the face of the earth, totally insignificant, right? And and so he adopts these kinds of atmospheric trees that you see in landscapes of that period and how they fade into oblivion. But his skies or atmospheres are also often punctuated by these really hard-edged optical phenomena, whether they're spectrums or thoughts, Bacon speech balloons or diagrammatic currents that also suggest kind of human intellect or mapping or impact on the planet. And so in his work, nature is still overwhelming us, but it's really through our own doing. Like here we have flooded plains, right? What could be more perfect? This was 2016, but we know what's going on right now with the recent flooding, hurricanes, raging forest fires out west. So it's our own doing that is making nature.
Okay.
Somebody needs to turn their sound off. Okay. Denise, whoops. And so, lost my track. Sorry. There we go. Denise Burge. She's also challenging our romantic ideas about tropical paradises with these kind of bleak beachscapes, denuded trees, the fresco or the painting on the wall, which almost looks like a bunker. It seems more dramatic than the actual, you know, sky or horizon or trees, which all seem kind of dead to me. And she is painting a lot from her memories of travels along the Carolina coast, and also a lot of recent trips to Miami, which inform her examination of how do we depict the tropical, how do we represent it? Often the tropical is associated with this kind of idyllic leisure and exotic glamour and, you know, fecundity and just life's bursting out from the seams. And she's kind of exploring that cultural fantasy and how that fantasy continues to be represented even when environmental realities kind of contradict that. Because the beauty and allure of, coastal areas could be very short-lived at this point. They're being literally swamped by climate change. You've got, all these carbon dioxide emissions from burning fossil fuels that have warmed the oceans, rising sea levels, salination of the water. You've got already pockets of Atlantic white cedar that have become ghost forests. You probably know in Florida that the mangrove forests that buffer are shrinking in size, and Florida's the state most at risk for flooding by the next century. And so we might, think about planting and protecting more trees that might preserve our notion of paradise and the possibility of our continued place in it, because a single young tree can absorb 26 pounds of carbon dioxide a year, and a mature tree, 50 pounds. So, whenever we see any single tree cut down, that's speeding us toward a kind of paradise lost. Scientists estimate that 15 billion trees are cut down each year, and that the number of trees on this earth has fallen by about 46% since the start of human civilization. And so the title of this, beginning of this series by Susanne Slavick, who is my sister, the series is called Elegy to the Underground. And that elegy is, kind of, it implies a mourning, right, a grief, and there's a lot to mourn. This piece, this is a painting that's actually in another group tree show of works by my sisters, but it's part of the series that you have in your gallery. And, it's the whole series is elegiac, but it also has an element of hope and a kind of offering a potential model for survival, because trees might save us to some extent if we might start cooperating with them more radically. And if we humble ourselves to the lessons that they have to offer. And those lessons are often literally underground, because whether or not we think of trees as sentient beings, as, feeling beings or whatever, Sarah's imagery draws from the scientific evidence that shows how trees of the same species are communal. They can also form alliances with trees of other species and live in these cooperative, interdependent relationships that are assisted by latticed fungi or mycorrhizal networks. And about 90% of land plants are living in these mutually beneficial relationships with fungi. And these relationships do everything from boosting immunity and sharing nutrients and information, even between plants that are widely separated. So trees are sensitive. They can detect gravity, light, magnetic fields, pathogens, and more. They can alert each other to disease and drought and attacks by insects, animals. They can alter their neighbors' behaviors in ways that increase their chances for survival. And some of this communication comes through chemical, hormonal, slow pulsing electrical signals, pheromones, and other scent signals. A lot of this stuff we don't even see, right? It's almost like it's phantom-like, and which leads me into Pat Bellin-Gillen's paintings, which is called Phantom Limbs, Sentimental Void. And in her, this is a huge piece where her limbs are cut and pruned and hollowed out wood and might be seen as wounded, right? We might see these wounds as embodying lack and longing. And these are kind of arboreal amputees that still feel the pain of what was once there, like phantom limbs. But we're not really sure we recognize or understand what caused the trauma or that pain. And typically we want to keep the picture rosy. We don't want to know, or it's just a natural mechanism of denial to kind of concoct a rosier picture. But these creatures around the stump, you've got this kind of hallucinatory woodpecker and this sinuous sawfish that are either performing the amputations, or maybe they're kind of probing the stump, the decay for nutrients, and they're spiraling gracefully out of nowhere back into oblivion, and kind of suggesting, in a larger kind of scheme of things, the continuity of history and our human behavior, our ability to harm and destroy, but also the ability to heal in endless cycles. So detail. And come back to this painting by Alex Lucas, where you have trees that are both dead and alive, and kind of in this dystopic world. You don't see any human beings, but they're responsible for the environment before us. And even though this is a smaller painting, it's kind of got a panoramic format. And that panoramic view kind of alludes to the grand 19th century depictions of the American landscape as a place ripe for discovery and conquering and exploitation and conversion. Because intensive logging during that period took the lion's share of forests, 75%, which of the forests that were felled since 1630, when nearly half the land in this country that became the United States was actually blanketed with trees. And if you want to read about the decimation of forests around the world in an incredible novel by Annie Proulx, it's called Bark Skins. I really recommend it. But anyway, Lucas's surviving trees make us question the premises and the promises of manifest destiny doctrine that, the land is ours to take and to conquer. And then we come to Ellen Harvey's work. It's kind of this ghostly work called New Forest. And it makes us consider our exploitation, current exploitation of forests. This whole scene kind of seems provisional because it's done in these kind of filmy white lines. It's not chalk, but it almost looks chalky, as if you could easily erase it, right? They're not quite solid. And her forest is a young forest. It's arising from the ruins of an abandoned office building. And so you have these young saplings that are kind of trying to reach to whatever daylight's available among the concrete pillars and these obsolete bits of office equipment like old computer monitors and consoles and so on. And actually this painting was based, this is a detail of some of the computers. And this work was actually based on a design for this commissioned work called Reforestation that also are kind of equally fleeting lines because they're engraved on mirrors. So you kind of have to angle around to read the picture. And there's this confusion between inside and outside space where the forest kind of dissolves and reappears. And weirdly, this piece was part of a renovation project for an IRS building in Andover, Massachusetts. So I think it's really kind of bleakly funny that both these works kind of project a speculative future, one that we're not entirely in charge of creating, and where the architecture of modern bureaucracy and rationalism is reclaimed by nature. But unfortunately, in real life, bureaucracy and office life are more likely to do the claiming because they consume an enormous number of trees to produce the paper that they thrive on. The USA alone fells 68 million trees every year just to produce the paper and paper products that we use. And almost half of the daily office printouts end up in the trash and going straight to the landfill. And despite all the growth of digital communication and all the drives toward paperless offices, American paper consumption has increased 126% over the past 20 years. So we just keep going up. And we consume now 30% of the world's paper. And on average, it's hard for me to believe this, but on average, each of us in this country uses 700 pounds of paper products annually. So back to another set of work by Alex Lucas, where he captures these moments where people have inscribed names or dates or other kinds of commemorations into the bodies of trees, to their trunks, maybe as a way of unconsciously recognizing our kinship with them, because trees and humans share a quarter of their genes. So it's kind of not a stretch to see trees as kind of an extension of our own bodies. I think I skipped something. Hold on. No, okay, I guess not. Just want to make sure I didn't. Oh, yes, I did. Okay. So I just wanted to say that Harvey's painting is kind of a quiet reversal of that trend of human sort of takeover of nature. And it's kind of a modest but sweet revenge. And then going to Alex's paintings, I just want to say that sometimes the damage that we see or do might seem really trivial, might seem really infinitesimal. And he's framing these intimate images of graffiti that have been inscribed, but they're telling. They kind of imply or indicate our larger attitude toward nature. And I just want to read this poem, one of the poems that Angel mentioned that accompanies some of these works. This poem is called Woods by W.H. Auden that I paired with this work. It goes, a well-kept forest begs Our Lady's grace. Someone is not disgusted, or at least is laying bets upon the human race, retaining enough decency to last. The trees encountered on a country stroll reveal a lot about a country's soul. A small grove massacred to the last ash, an oak with heart rot, give away the show. This great society is going to smash. They cannot fool us with how fast they go, how much they cost each other and the gods. Culture is no better than its woods. So I hope you get a chance to enjoy some of the text in relation to the images. And if you can't go to the actual gallery, the Facebook page of the gallery includes photographs of all the text, which is really great. Thank you for doing that. Oops. Not advancing. Oh, there we go. Okay. So in another book that I love, it's a novel, won the Pulitzer Prize by Richard Powers, called The Overstory. There's a character in that book that refutes the centrality of human beings and notes, this is not our world with trees in it. It's a world of trees where humans have just arrived, because chronologically, we're a speck on the timeline of the life of trees on this planet. So anyway, I wanted to sort of invite people to think about how these seemingly harmless gestures in Lucas's prints kind of reflect our anthropocentric attitudes that, when we magnify them, do lead to the kind of devastating climate change that we're experiencing, and that is probably going to get a lot worse. So I'm going to jump to one of my paintings here, in the idea of commemoration, because sometimes I think, inscribing our names is like, I was here. It's a way of commemorating our presence, right? And it is a way of kind of establishing a kinship. Anyway, I saw this particular tree. It's the cedar of Lebanon, and I saw it as this wounded body. And even though this particular tree was wounded by a freak tornado, it could stand for the damage we do to ourselves and the planet, and how we try to recover. So in the daytime version of this painting, it's got this pale atmosphere, and then you have this kind of bandages that are almost like raw flesh. And I want that to kind of simultaneously suggest cruelty and comfort and compassion. And in the show is the nighttime version here, where the tree's amputated limbs and the rescue equipment contrast a kind of bleak realism with a hopeful romanticism. So I actually saw this tree on this tiny island in a lake in northern Italy. And it was after this freak tornado that had broken the limbs. And when I was visiting it, these gardeners were like frantically trying to resuscitate the tree by pulling it up with these cables and these sprinkler systems and wrapping the open wounds. And I still don't know if it survived, but they were doing their damnedest to kind of rescue this tree. And weirdly, at the same time, cedar of Lebanon is the national tree of Lebanon, the country. And at that very moment or time when I was there, the Israeli Defense Forces were bombing Lebanon, and also wars were going on in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it just made me think of, the damage we do to each other, and how do we recover, from both human and environmental violence. Because I was thinking, the effort that they were exerting to rescue this tree was scaled to the planet. I don't know. I don't know if the result would be any more promising or not, because we're at or beyond the tipping point. So trees are, this is just a detail of one of the, implements. Trees are often planted to commemorate the loss of loved ones, whether they're civilians or soldiers. And we saw this at the commemoration of World War I in England, under the banner of "We Will Stand for Those Who Fell," planting these young saplings. And so these arboreal cycles of regeneration and recovery serve, I think, as metaphors for mourning, memorial, and also moving on. And I hope for moving forward in peace and sustainability. And so I wanted to end, since I paired poems and excerpts from prose with all of these works, I wanted to end with a passage, again by Richard Powers in his novel, The Overstory. He writes, "That's the trouble with people, their root problem. Life runs alongside them, unseen, right here, right next, creating the soil, cycling water, trading in nutrients, making weather, building atmosphere, feeding and curing and sheltering more kinds of creatures than people know how to count. A chorus of living woods sings to the woman. If your mind were only a slightly greener thing, we drown you in meaning. The pine she leans against says, listen, there's something we need to hear." And so in projects like these, I want our minds to become slightly greener things, and the works I share to insist there's something we need to see. So thank you, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Yeah, first question is, where is this on exhibit? So we are at the Rosemary Duffy Larson Gallery on Central Campus of Broward College in Davie, Florida. And that first comment by Christine about the genetics of trees being so close to humans, I had never heard that before. That was amazing.
Yeah, I mean, that's true of a lot of interspecies I mean, we all share a lot of genetic material and the racial shifts, between species. But yeah, it is interesting. This book, the Overstory, I'm telling you, will blow your mind with the amount of this. Richard Powers is like this Renaissance man. He started out in computer programming, but he just knows so much about so many things, music, and this this novel called The Echo Maker, which is very much about the migration of sandhill cranes and this curious brain disease. Anyway, he's amazing. And if you were blown away by that, there is a million more in that book. So I really recommend it. And thanks, Christine. Christine's a former student, so it's really nice to see her here many years ago. And she's an artist too. And then Anne asked, is there a place for beauty and romanticism in contemporary art in relation to the environment? Yeah, I think a lot of the works in this show are quite beautiful. And even though they're sometimes questioning romanticism, the romanticization of nature, I think they're, okay, a couple things. I think by reminding us of what we stand to lose is one thing, because if we recognize, really, are we gonna always have this around us, this beauty? I sometimes, I know even the number of birds that are singing is dwindling. And so when I hear the birds singing now, I'm even more appreciative, because I don't know how much longer we're going to have even as many species of birds that we currently have. So I think, portraying the beauty of what we had, what we currently have, what we might have if we get smart, is really critical. And I think beauty can be a motivator too. I don't think it's always a mask or a feel-good, panacea. It can be motivating that this is something I want to preserve, and I need to do something to preserve it. I can't be passive about it. So yeah, and I think beauty and even pattern and what we might think of as the ornamental and the decorative, that's one of the ways we recognize our own humanity in each other, because every culture has its own decorative traditions and aesthetic traditions, and that we can appreciate and admire, even if we don't understand everything about it. It's something we recognize in each other. We recognize our commonality, which is also important, because, climate crisis is not just a national problem. It's a huge international problem, and the dysfunctionality of our individual governments is really a problem. And then trying to get the whole world to cooperate is even a bigger problem. So we have to work on the local, smaller scale, and we have to try to work on the grander scale as well. So that was a long-winded response, but yes, Anne, I think so. It has a role.
I think some of the questions were really about where to see the exhibition. So again, if you're local, we're in Building 6 on Central Campus at Broward College. And if you are not local, definitely check us out at browardvpa.com. This is the first event that does come up when you open the page, and you can also check out past events. I think there's nothing like seeing it in person, but what's great about it is that you can come back and see it anytime, not just, now here in person, it's only through September 22nd, but we can continue to enjoy it online. Anne has a new question. How do you navigate the environmental footprint of art materials? That's a really good question.
Yes, and I know Anne is particularly sensitive to this because she runs incredible workshops. And Anne, I feel free to talk about what you do too, because you're probably more keyed into that than I am, because I'm still working with oil paint, and it has those solvents, and there are some toxic pigments. I'm very careful with their disposal. We have hazardous waste disposal pickup here at Carnegie Mellon, and I just bring my paint into that. So at least it's not just going into the general landfill. So yeah, I think it's important to, be aware of our footprint near and far. I don't want to be defensive, but when I think of the Defense Department or corporate consumption of fossil fuels is like just so far beyond what any of us do with our recycling our cans and bottles, but it doesn't mean we should stop doing that, but we need to really focus on the major causes. But yes, I know practically every print shop in every university now is water-based instead of, oil-based, which just created really toxic environments. I had a printmaking professor that died of all the lacquer thinner and acetone that was used just went, really affected brains, So we're lucky that we're gradually becoming more aware of it. And feel free to chime in with anything you want to say on that front.
Well, I'm totally guilty. I use acrylics. I don't know if that's any better than oil paint or not. It's plastic. Plastic. So it's like, how do you get away from this stuff unless you're just going to like make your own paint or make your own ink or just use watercolor? I suppose watercolor is the least offensive. It's hard.
Question for artists to ask, and I know a lot of artists don't want to just make more objects in the world, so they will recycle things or they will use materials that are already exist in the world and repurpose them. Or make them temporary and ephemeral so that they go back to whatever state they were in, or they go back to their source. So if you can be more radical about your stance about that if you choose to. I think there was another question here. How important is it for the artist to balance the content of the work, its message, with the delivery method? Well, I give a whole lecture on what we call form and content. And I think it's important that they literally be wedded. And even if it's in a traditional painting or if it's an installation or an intervention in a social environment, you have to think about how the material, how the technique, how the light, how the composition all support the meaning of your work, because art isn't just a formal exercise. You can't help but make meaning, even if you're making an abstract painting that you think has no political content. The very fact that you're making a painting, you're making a world, you're envisioning and making a world that is different from the world you live in. And that very act is either a subtle or an overt reminder to you and your audience that things can be different from the way they are. Now, that's not my idea. That's Herbert Marcuse, who talks about, he's a philosopher who talks about how artists continually violate the reality principle by making up these worlds, and that it's important psychologically for us to know that we can invent these worlds and maybe we can realize them in real life. Maybe we don't want to realize what we paint in our paintings because they're horrible, they're nightmarish, or we're reflecting the world rather than envisioning a new world. It can be both, it's important to do both. So yeah, I think it's really important to really try to integrate the form and the technique and all of the formal considerations with what it is you're trying to convey. And it doesn't mean art has to be propaganda where it has to have this blasting message. I don't mean that either. I think there's lots of room for ambiguity. And we also, I've said this in prior lectures, because especially in America, we tend to value the purely utilitarian. We tend not to value the idealistic. And so a lot of times, people think about, well, what's useful about art, and there's a pressure to instrumentalize it, to make it, do a job, but I'm for that to some extent, but I also want to preserve the space for pure pleasure and pure experimentation. We need that. We need relief, not escape, but relief, so that we can energize to do things, whether it's in the studio or as active as citizens. Artists aren't going to change the world with a painting or, with a body of work overnight. It's part of their larger life that has many dimensions, as parents, as lovers, as protesters, as voters, as, it's all wrapped up into one.
Thank you. That was great. Okay, so we have some people asking about the recording. It will be on browardvpa.com, hopefully by next week. It'll also be on our YouTube channel, probably before that. Some thank yous. And it looks like, yeah, and Christine, reiterating that there's been a lot of research on this topic for artists being more ecologically friendly. Here's one person I heard of who writes about this, Scott Denholm, and he makes his artwork with these guidelines. And we've had some work recently in the gallery, different artists dealing with this too. So I think more and more this question is coming up. We had an artist last year that only used materials that were discarded, and then after the show, he would find another home for them.
Yep. Yes, there is a way to, be more consciously ethical about, your imprint in every aspect of your lives, including your studio life. Yeah. At the end of the semester, they used to just throw away everything that the students left behind. It just drove me crazy. So now, now we have a summer crew that basically cleans off the stretchers and, everything gets reused to the extent that it can, which saves them time, money, and the environment. So it's great, but it's just one little thing. But it's really important. I don't know if there's another question up here. Can't.
We may have gotten.
The romanticization of nature. Well, I talked a little bit about that in the lecture itself, and how we say if we can willfully unaware what we can be about our current. We do want to hide our heads in the sand. We do. We have to pull them out, and find a way to make an impact. Whether it's planting more trees in your own yard, in your park, joining up with the volunteer. There's lots of city civic groups that plant things, writing your representatives, whatever way you can find it. It all counts. It all helps.
Absolutely. And even making art about it to
we all
inspire those actions.
Yes. We all have to use the language we're most fluent in, whether it's talking, painting, singing, whatever.
Absolutely. So unless there are any other questions, I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight and speaking about the work. So that was the Overstory they were asking about, right? Overstory?
Yes, the Overstory, and the other novel I mentioned was Bark Skins, all one word, by Annie Proulx, Proulx.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you all for coming and participating. Again, thank you, Susanne, for organizing the show, sharing it with us, and sharing more information behind it. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for everybody who showed up. Thanks.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Good night, everyone.